Welcome to Flipping the Table. Today, Michael and his guest, author and journalist Lisa Hamilton, talk about agrarians, those who live by growing crops and raising livestock. They use the lens of Lisa's two books, Deeply Rooted and The Hungry Season, from which you'll hear short readings. Agrarians are a tiny minority in the nation, making up less than 1% of the population. Yet their contributions to our daily sustenance and their examples of perseverance in the face of obstacles can be an inspiration for us all. Enjoy the show.
Tall, lean, and tan. You can easily imagine Lisa Hamilton taking notes or shooting pictures from any rolling-hilled ranch or sun-baked farm field in the world. And that's what Lisa Hamilton does. I don't know anyone who has spent more hours talking with or writing about those who grow our food or raise our livestock in unconventional ways. At heart, Lisa is an environmentalist, and I would argue an anthropologist, one who studies the origins, development, and behavior of humans. Her focus is agrarians, the people who live from the practice of agriculture. Today, we will hear short passages from each of her two books that chronicle the lives of four farming and ranching families that live and work outside the mainstream of the agricultural system. And we will converse about what life is like for agrarians and what they might offer the rest of us about living in a time of great disruption and stress. I first met Lisa in the fall almost 20 years ago, when she brought her camera to a turkey harvest event. My Slow Food chapter, named for the Russian River, had funded a gaggle of 4-H kids to raise for our members about 100 heritage breed turkeys using organic feed. Our goal was to support the kids' interest in organic production and to give them a taste of a direct relationship to their customers, a local market system. Over the 2 days of the weekend prior to Thanksgiving, about 20 of our chapter members gathered at a local farm with the 4-H kids and their families to slaughter and clean the birds. Lisa came to that event to document it. Her piece showed up on national television and in print media to reflect the desire of consumers to access good food for their holiday tables. In 2009, she published her first book titled Deeply Rooted, Unconventional Farmers in the Age of Agribusiness. It told the story of 3 agrarian families she came to know over several years. Then, a few years later, Roots of Change provided matching funds for Lisa to travel the state of California, shooting images and writing what became a series of 20 photo essays documenting the rural people of the state. This series, titled Real Rural, became a visual campaign displayed in the Bay Area Regional Transit, or BART trains, that carry tens of thousands of people throughout the San Francisco Bay Area each day. Then, this last fall, Lisa published her latest book, The Hungry Season, a journey of war, love, and survival. Like the first book, this book is beautifully written, but it focuses on one singular woman, an immigrant Hmong woman from Laos who came to Fresno, California in 1992 and created a unique, small rice farm that now serves the Hmong immigrant community across the nation. It is a compelling biography with common and contrasting themes found in her earlier work. So today, Lisa and I will explore what we can learn from the agrarian people she clearly loves. Let's begin. Lisa Hamilton, really glad to have you here today. Welcome, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. Thanks for having me here, Michael.
Yeah. So let's begin, actually. I want you to read something from your 2009 book, Deeply Rooted, which is a fabulous book. So if we could start with that, I think it sets good context.
I'm happy to read it. It's interesting, actually, looking back on something that was written, more than 15 years ago. So many things can change and cease to be true. But as I read these words, I realize it's still exactly true for me and what I do as a journalist. So This is from the introduction of Deeply Rooted. As a person who writes about agriculture, I spend a fair amount of time in places that have grown quiet over the past 50 years. Gibbon, Minnesota, Bluffton, Georgia, unincorporated Fremont County, Wyoming. My visits there are not fast-paced. Indeed, I pass most of my time sitting in the passenger seat of a truck, on the wheel well of a tractor, on whatever flat space is free in the cab of a combine. But as my hosts and I make slow revolutions around a field or drive from one pasture to another, what happens is not dull. What happens is we talk, or typically, they talk. On most days, the conversation lasts for hours. They are farmers and ranchers, though generally not those from the front row of the church, that select few who remain in conventional agriculture. These are the ones who were trimmed off long ago, or at least by the industry's prescription, should have been. As we sit and talk, the topics are sometimes technical, often political or economic, and always, ultimately, philosophical and personal. If we start with a discussion of soil microbiology or a comparison of turkey breeds, inevitably we end up in family, history, ecology, faith, beauty, morality, and the fate of the world to come. For them, all those things are linked. As they see it, agriculture is not an industry on the periphery of modern civilization. It is a fundamental act that determines whether we as a society will live or die. What binds these people is not a particular farming method, but rather the conviction that as humans, the contributions they make are essential. Conventional agriculture doesn't need people for much more than to run the machines and carry the debt, but these people refuse that lifeless role. To the work, they bring their intellects and their consciences, their histories and their concerns for the future. In quiet ways, in quiet places, they have set about correcting the damage that has come from believing agriculture could actually be reduced to numbers alone. The first step, reclaim their place in the center of the equation.
Great. Thank you. I love that. Reclaim their place in the center of the equation. Firm believer in that. The entire civilization, as we understand it today, is based on the land and the people that are producing the food upon which we all depend. So to start, I'm always interested to hear my guest origin story. Why are you writing about rural and agrarian people?
Well, contrary to what you would think, I did not grow up on a farm. I grew up in Boston, before that Maine. Never really had anything to do with farmers, aside from the people who lived down the road from my grandmother when I was growing up, until I went to college in Washington State. I went there sort of as an environmentalist, meaning to study something to sort of better the world through the natural world. But I went to Evergreen in Olympia, Washington, and they had an organic farming program there. And through some of my classes, I met some of the people who were studying to be organic farmers. And through them, I touched this active environmentalism, or I guess at first I was just exposed to this idea of a really tangible environmentalism. This was not, campaigning to save a place that I'd never been or save an animal that I'd never seen. This was hands in the ground at your feet, changing things literally from the ground up. And it just lit me aflame from the first time that I can remember. This farmer named Jim McGinn, he's still farming up there outside Olympia, Washington. He started talking to me about some of these principles about organic farming. It had never even occurred to me that agriculture could be transformational, that it could be a tool for changing the larger systems within our society. And pretty much from that moment, late in my first year of college, this was what became my passion. And even within my years in college, I started writing about farmers. At Evergreen is a funny school in that I still haven't declared my major. I graduated decades ago, but you don't actually have to declare a major. But if I had, it would have been journalism with a focus in sustainable agriculture and community development. And that's what I'm still doing today.
Amazing. Both the books we're going to talk about and actually the connections that I first saw you around having to do with the slow food movement and then your kind of photographic journey across California for Real Rural really said to me, wow, this is interesting. I haven't really met anyone that focuses on agrarian people, rural people so deeply. And so I'm interested in if the term agrarian, the term rural mean the same thing to you. Are they the same?
It's a great question. I mean, if you go back 200 years or, maybe less in other places, to be rural necessarily meant that you were agrarian, right? I mean, if you go back far enough, there wasn't much of a commerce to agriculture or anything else happening in rural areas. I mean, it's a generalization, but you know what I mean. These days, you can certainly be a rural person, meaning living in a rural area without having more or less anything to do with agriculture. I think when you talk about agrarian people, that connection to the land where they are and producing a livelihood from it still exists. And that's, at least for me, the big difference. Go to some of these places, like I mentioned in the beginning of that introduction to Deeply Rooted, Bluffton, Georgia, Gibbon, Minnesota. I can guarantee you there are plenty of people within the communities there who no longer are drawing their own livelihood. They might have memories of their grandparents as farmers, their parents as farmers. Land has been consolidated. Other industries have come up. People commute, and that agrarian relationship to place slowly dies off.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have been struck really in recent years. I moved to Sonoma County, which was much more rural when I first came here in 1990 than it is today. It's more urbanized. And I wonder, sometimes I take hope, and maybe I'm an illusion. I'm really curious what you think, that people who are not agrarian but move to a rural region might become more sensitized to agrarianism, agrarian life, and might become more sympathetic and therefore more supportive of that. I mean, I think of West Marin, I think of Sonoma County, Healdsburg, Mendocino County, where people are moving. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that's because there are a lot of young people who are moving because they can work online now, and if they can get to the internet from a rural region? I've been reading and know young people who have traveled around the United States living in rural regions and working online because they want to be in a rural setting. And they're foodies, a lot of them. So, I mean, is this pie in the sky? What am I, an illusion?
No, I mean, I think there is a natural attraction for most of us, right? I mean, I'm thinking of Swanton Berry Farm down...
Davenport, yeah.
Yeah, down in Davenport. And people are driving an hour or two from San Jose or from, somewhere in Silicon Valley just to get to Swanton Berry Farm, just to go out and pick those berries for an afternoon. I've had people tell me about it, well, like unbidden, that this was the best thing that they did all weekend or all summer, because they had that very short experience that touched this tiny little memory in the backs of their brains that maybe they aren't even conscious of, that this is a thrilling experience to go to a plant and pull off food. And I mean, particularly a strawberry, right? It's better than like going to a barley you pick. But I think exists in pretty much all of us this connection to a past that's pretty long ago for most of us. And it's activated when you finally get exposed to it. The question that you posed, though, I think it brings up another question. So maybe you have people moving to rural areas and being excited by the agrarianism they see, by reconnecting with some aspects of agriculture. And I think it's true that it engenders a certain kind of sympathy, but how far does the sympathy go? And that can be interesting in a place like Sonoma County. Yes, you want a beautiful, say, vineyard, or maybe you want to see sheep grazing out in the pasture. Do you want the smell of hogs near you, or cattle? You know, in West Marin, that's sort of an interesting question all along, like continuing to this day, the smell of dairy cows. Do you want to have, a special cheese from these cows grazed on pasture, but also have the smell of their manure when you're trying to have a nice brunch in your garden? It can bring up some interesting conflicts,
it is
is all I'm
interesting.
saying.
It reminds me, every fall when they're spreading manure here in Sonoma County, and the breeze comes from the ocean, I can smell it.
Yeah.
And I'm always reminded, oh yeah, the dairies are out there. I'm smelling it right now. And I'm for sure for some people it's they don't like it, but for me, I'm like, wow.
Right.
We are in an agricultural community.
Right.
And it's cool. So one of the things we're going to do today is we're going to talk mostly about your new book, The Hungry Season. But I am curious, both The Hungry Season, which we'll talk about, and Deeply Rooted are about agrarian people with agrarian roots. So you've seen a lot of communities, because Deeply Rooted takes you to 3 different parts of the country where you get into a deep description of 3 kind of agrarian families. In the course of that, you see differences and commonalities. And actually, it comes through, I think, in The Hunger Season, which is really about someone from a completely different country, from Laos, a Hmong woman who's a rice farmer near Fresno. So I'm very curious about what you see. Are the differences, and what are the commonalities between all those people that you've so deeply written about?
Well, I guess it's best to start with the commonalities. As I wrote in the introduction to Deeply Rooted, some of which I just read, ever since college, I didn't, I think, know it then why I was writing about people, but it was just what I instinctively did. And over time, I've come to understand that the reason is that relationship to agriculture and to land, that people within agriculture, not everyone, I'll say the subtitle of Deeply Rooted is Unconventional Farmers in the Age of Agribusiness. So it's these people who reject the conventional model of agriculture that says that the farmer is basically a medium for technology and for outside knowledge. The farmer holds the debt, the farmer owns the cows, but the wisdom is coming from somewhere else. I'm drawn to writing about people who reject that model because at the root of my beliefs is this understanding that one of the fundamental things that went wrong when agriculture was industrialized here and as it is industrialized around the world, even today, is that the pieces that humans alone can bring are lost. And so my intention is to write the stories of, celebrate, and also portray the struggles of people who reject that model and are holding on to the human presence within agriculture, which I think is essential. I mean, I would venture to say that essentially everyone who's ever been on this podcast, all the different perspectives, all the different situations that people are talking about, at the deepest root of what they're describing is either the presence of that human intervention, that human contribution, or the absence of it. That's, I would say, 99% of the time where agriculture goes wrong or agriculture goes right.
Mm-hmm. So the commonality that you're seeing is that all these people, and would you include Ia from The Hungry Season, would she have that same linkage?
Well, it's an interesting question. You know, there are 3 farmers in the book Deeply Rooted. There's Harry Lewis, who is a dairy farmer in East Texas, Virgil Trujillo, who is an 8th generation rancher in New Mexico, going back before
the Spanish.
Yeah, exactly. But before, it was New Mexico, called New Mexico. And then the Podol family up in North Dakota, who grow an incredible diversity of crops and have a seed business and do a lot of plant breeding of their own. And so the three of them are not obviously linked, but through the course of the book, you see that what links them is this unconventionality, this really bringing human knowledge, human values, human attention to agriculture. Ia Mua, who is the sole protagonist of The Hungry Season, it's really her biography in a way. Her story is so fundamentally different in that she was born in Laos in the mountains to a family that farmed rice, as virtually everyone else in the mountains of Laos did, and largely at a subsistence level. So there were very little commerce at play there. She then, of course, as we can discuss later, she was forced out of her home by the American-sponsored war that ran parallel to the Vietnam War. She ended up in a refugee camp in Thailand for 15 years before immigrating to the United States in 1993. She landed in Fresno and slowly, bit by bit, became a rice farmer, again, this time in Fresno, bringing a lot of the same knowledge, the same seeds from Laos, but a completely different context, of course. Fresno, California couldn't be more different from the mountains of Laos. And so she does not exist within the community or the framework, the thought patterns of sustainable agriculture, the organic agriculture movement in the United States. What Ia is doing, farming rice, it's her own. And it's not surprising that nobody's ever heard of her outside of the Hmong community. She's not some, star at Eco Farm down in Monterey. She's on what seems like a very different track.
She's unconventional.
But she remains unconventional in that, particularly within the context of Fresno, which, as I've described in the book, and I think I'll read a little bit later, is a grid. It is straight lines, straight rows, everything in dollars and pounds and tons. And there's very little human contribution left in that system. There's very, very little room for it. The way that Ia is so unconventional within that system is that her farming system is all about, it can't exist without her. There is no outside contribution. She's not leaning on wisdom from anyone outside of herself, aside from her parents and
although
her
she is using pesticides. So she is using some things.
Oh, certainly, but she's using them in her own way.
Right.
There's no prescription.
Right.
There's no one telling her how to farm.
Right.
She is entirely,
and she's doing it all by hand.
And she's doing it all by hand. Yeah, there isn't even the intervention of machines.
Maybe a hoe, but yeah. I mean, it's incredible.
Right. And it's much more than that. It's not just, it would be easy to hear this and think like, oh, well, there's just this romanticization of growing rice by hand like, subsistence farmers around the world do. That's not what I mean here. What I mean is that she's never even felt the pressure from outside to do things in the way that the industry demands or prescribes.
Would require to participate.
Yeah, exactly. It is a really interesting challenge that's presented to her or that she faces when she begins farming rice in Fresno, because even beyond climate, rainfall, soils, angle of the land, even beyond all those differences, the greatest difference is that the Fresno is fundamentally it's capitalized agriculture. You cannot farm in Fresno unless you are a billionaire, millionaire, what have you. I guess there are a lot of millionaires who aren't making it, but billionaire, you can't farm in Fresno without finding a way to make a profit, because it's so damn expensive, if nothing else than for the water that you need to either pay to pump up or buy out of the water districts. So that's a real challenge to this system. That's the sort of the first time that this very quite ancient system, honestly, of planting rice that she knows from her time in Laos, but also almost like in her DNA. It's the first time it's been challenged in that sense of like, okay, now you have to make this profitable and to pay your rent, to pay your water, to pay your electricity, et cetera. So that's the great challenge. But she holds on to her way of doing it and herself as the central source of wisdom about the land, about the plants, the crop, and how to make the whole equation work.
We hope you're enjoying the conversation. If you are, please rate our podcast and offer a review. Your voice will help us grow our listener base, which helps us sustain the funding to share these conversations with the people and organizations shaping a more just and regenerative future. A future in which the food and farm businesses are helping to solve the largest challenges of our time.
Well, it's interesting. It's reminding me of the conversation we had before we started recording while we were eating lunch, this idea of paying attention, because a lot of the book describes how she's paying attention and how she's watching what's happening with the rice, what's happening with the weather, what's happening with her family. All those things she's watching very carefully in order to be able to manage this piece of ground, which is very hard for one person to manage. Even though it's a very small farm, in the context of one person managing rice, it's a huge task. And before we go back into her in depth for the balance of the day or the conversation, I want to just touch on one other thing. I was really taken with the way that in Deeply Rooted, how the pattern that I saw was at the beginning of each chapter, you kind of describe the setting, where you are, what kind of a community is. And then you get into the people, and then you go very deeply into the people, and not just the individual that's the prime protagonist, but the families, the relational pieces, as mentioned in the introduction that you read. So I'm just curious about, as you think back on those families, those people, is there anyone that really sticks out that your mind goes back to as you think about agrarian life, agrarianism, the transformation of the food system that we need?
The truth is, I think about all of them in different ways from time to time. It has been 15 years, and sadly, Harry Lewis has passed away. So he's not there doing what he does anymore.
Is his family still dairying? Are they?
I believe not.
Huh.
Yeah, I believe that his son was not interested in taking over, which is too bad, but maybe someone else has taken over that land. I'm not sure. The family that I have the most contact with, and so I'm most current on, is the Podolls. I imagine that some of your listeners have experienced them through their seed business. It's called Prairie Road Organic Farm. And after decades of breeding their own plants, tomatoes and popcorn and watermelon, pumpkin, so on, they started a seed business. And it was a way of supporting not just one family, but two families on the farm as the two brothers who stayed grew up and had their own families. The same amount of land needed to support more people. So that was an innovation of theirs. They come to mind as people holding the keys to the future, in the sense that that's what they're always thinking about. They're thinking about adapting, looking ahead, sometimes David in particular in a very doomsday way, although, who can argue with that right now,
Right.
Particularly summer of 2024.
Right. Having just had fires and heat domes.
Exactly. I was reading about today in New Mexico, within the state, they are simultaneously dealing with wildfires and flood conditions.
Yes.
So I think that, doomsday thinking is warranted, and it's something that certainly David Podol and his brother Dan and Dan's wife Teresa have been thinking about for a long time. Their very most fundamental goal is to feed themselves, and they do a tremendous job of that in North Dakota, where the winters are long and bitter,
brutal, right?
Bitter. that wind, it feels like it just blows down unimpeded from like the top of Canada all the way across the plains to their farm. Can be hellish in the winter. They are feeding themselves 12 months a year. From that has grown this adaptation to that place, these particular plants that they've adapted to that place, and ideas about how to adapt, new kinds of knowledge. It's I think, revolutionary on their part that they're not just rejecting the conventional model of agriculture, they're also rejecting the idea that knowledge about genetics and about plant breeding can only come from within the university or university system. Or
they're getting back to what people used to do, breeding their own plants for where they lived.
Exactly, yeah. and incorporating that university research and so on, but doing it themselves and believing in their own knowledge and attention as farmers to, in some ways, be able to do it in a superior way. To adapt plants to their particular place. And in fact, it was sort of coming off of the ideas that I was exposed to and really thrived within the story of the Podolls about adapting plants for future conditions, making them more resilient, that ultimately led me to write The Hungry Season. Granted, published it 15 years later, started working at 8 years, or I guess maybe 7 years after finishing Deeply Rooted. But it's that
connection
idea,
to adaptation.
Yeah, that idea of resilience, of adapting our plants and relying on genetic diversity in order to be able to adapt. That's really the foundation of the book, The Hungry Season.
That's perfect. Let's go to the introduction of The Hungry Season.
Okay.
Because there's some sections in there. There's 3 really beautiful paragraphs that I'd like you to read. And then we'll dive deep into Ia's story and the ultimate lessons of that story.
I just want to say, as a prelude to this prologue, just to connect the sort of learning that I had from the Podolls about resilience and adaptation up, through 15 years. After writing Deeply Rooted, I wrote a series of articles that had to do with genetic diversity and plant breeding and alternative approaches to plant breeding, and really the crisis in plant breeding in the United States and around the world. And initially, I had set out to write a book about just that, about genetic diversity in plants and agriculture, and how preserving that genetic diversity leads to resilience. I had intended to write about rice, and I sort of set out looking for a human story to embody that story of resilience, that was within the history of rice. And by twists and turns, I hadn't intended to write about anyone in the United States because I didn't think that still existed in rice farming. But I was introduced through a circuitous path to Hmong farmers in Fresno who are growing rice, and eventually to Ia. And she does not speak English, and I do not speak Hmong. So we were working with a professional interpreter, and did for the 7 years that I was working on this book. But the first day I met Ia, I was actually visiting a farmer next door to her. And Ia invited us over to talk. And after we finished talking and eating lunch together, she pulled the interpreter aside and she said, if you guys ever want to talk to me, I've got some stories to tell. And that was the beginning of our relationship. I went back to visit her the next week. And from there on, the book just sort of effortlessly became about her. I wasn't even aware of it, but the book shifted from being a book about rice to being a book about Ia. Fast forward 5 years of reporting in the field, the book is, when it was actually finished, rice becomes a way of a lens through which to see Ia, rather than Ia a lens through which to see rice. But I realized at the end of the day, the book was still about resilience. It still was that original intention, just in a very different form that I hadn't anticipated at all. Because really that resilience is at the heart of who Ia is and why her story matters.
Yeah. What's interesting, though, it kind of goes to the whole theme today, is the resilience of human beings in a very real sense is based on this ability for human beings to be in right relationship to the ground upon which they are living. So let's jump into what you're going to read here.
And you can imagine how difficult that would be, having learned how to be in relationship to the land in
Laos.
In the mountains of Laos, and then being
It's
transplanted.
humid and tropical.
Yeah,
and
transplanted
mountainous.
to flat, dry Fresno. So this is the very beginning of the book. This is the beginning of the prologue, the hungry season. And please forgive me my Hmong pronunciation. I still rely on the
we won't know.
interpreter. My Hmong pronunciation is terrible. They call this particular rice ble niatai, grandmother rice. Some say it's named for the person it came from. The farmer got the seed from her brother, who got it from a friend, who got it from his wife, who got it from her mother. That mother has a name, but no one would have used it since before she was married. As an old woman, she would just be called grandmother, grandmother's rice. Others say that the rice was given this name because it yields so much, taking care of you with its bounty the way a grandmother's love softens the sharp edges of life. And it's true. This year, all the farm's rice grew tall and thick, but none like the grandmother rice. In mid-October, when the wands of ripe grain have bowed under their own weight and curved back down toward the earth, the arc of the grandmother rice is taller than anyone on the farm. Below, its long, sword-shaped leaves have plaited together in such a tangle that the spaces between rows disappear. Entering this thicket, the farmer must first push with her shoulder, then draw her arms through, as if opening a heavy door. As she passes inward, the vegetation rejoins behind her. Were she to release herself and fall backward, the grandmother rice would hold her up. When the farmer is enclosed like this, the only view is straight up to the blank blue sky. The road running alongside the field disappears, the din of traffic fades. As the honeyed fragrance of rice fills her head, she can imagine herself back to the place of her memories. The village where she was born was swallowed up by the jungle in the years after the war, but it is still alive in her mind. All around are steep mountains shrouded in clouds. The village itself is level, set amid gentle green hills with blue skies above. It is never too hot there, never too cold. The air is sweet with sugar cane, the land thick with wild fruit trees. Every morning, a choir of birds. Even today, 40 years later, standing in this grandmother rice can transport her back to there. Then, it's almost as if she could reach into the tangle of leaves and touch her parents, close to her once again. An orphan, no more.
Wow. When I read that, first of all, it's beautifully written.
Thank you.
Well done. I mean, it's touching. The other thing that really, in the context of my earlier question to you about what they have in common, this woman from Laos who farms in Fresno of a rice variety that comes from her homeland, and the three people that you feature in Deeply Rooted, all of them have a connection to the past. It's a living connection. Unlike a lot of people in the modern age. For instance, I have on my father's side and my mother's side, both of them their grandparents came from rural communities. But I really have no connection to my mother's father, who grew up in the Mississippi Delta, and he was born in 1901. No connection to understanding of what he grew up in that rural region. My father's family, Northern California, timber country. I have no connection to that. No memory of it, because those stories were not transferred to me, which is a loss, I feel. I don't know if everybody does, but I feel that loss. But she has it, that connection, and so do all the other people that you wrote about. That's an important thing, it seems to me.
Absolutely. It's an unquantifiable piece of that human contribution. And I have never really found a great way to talk about it, actually. I'm a writer, so I'm supposed to. But when I talk about the human contributions to agriculture, I talk about morality, values. I guess values is better way to put it than morality, but the values that only humans can bring, the attention that only humans can bring. I often also say history and remembering. And it's so hard to quantify what that actually brings to your practice as a farmer, as a rancher. But you can see it certainly in Ia, certainly in Virgil Trujillo, in the 8th generation rancher in New Mexico, when he is making decisions about his land and how to keep it productive, how to keep himself afloat, but also how to go forward. He sees those decisions as part of a long arc that began before he was even born.
Before Europeans came. Well,
Yeah. Before the Americans came and took over. When Ia is farming rice in Fresno, certainly she's making decisions about how to make a profit just to stay in business. But her decisions also, in their own way, are informed by being part of a long arc. And there can be a sort of responsibility within that to uphold a tradition. There's also memory, a kind of wisdom about how to get through challenges. I'm thinking in particular of this one season when
the drought.
God, it was so painful to witness this. It's described in detail in the book, but there's one planting season where it just doesn't work.
Right.
It's always worked before. Mm-hmm. And the rice is just dying or not even coming up. And she reaches back into her memory and remembers something like this happening to her parents. I mean, she was still little, but she remembers that they would pre-sprout. She didn't have a lot of seed left in, 2018. She remembers her parents being in a pinch like this, pre-sprouting the rice and then planting each of those tiny pre-germinated seeds hand by hand, one by one, so that you wouldn't have the loss of putting 10 seeds in a hole and having only 6 come up, what have you. That kind of wisdom comes from that long arc, and at the same time, a kind of responsibility, a sense that I need to take care of this land, not just to make a profit today or tomorrow to keep my family right now in business, but I have a responsibility to carry on this tradition or to take care of this land because it's been entrusted to me by people who came before. And I think it is possible for farmers and ranchers to feel that if they haven't been on that land for generations and generations. There's certainly a lot of young farmers today who are just coming onto a piece of land and can feel that responsibility, but they have to choose it and they have to build it. They have to learn about the land. Whereas these people, whether it's Ia, Mua, or Virgil Trujillo, Harry Lewis, it's built into the practice. They would have to really fight hard to separate out that long arc and just focus on right here, right now. And pretty different decisions would be made if all that matters is right here, right now.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it is interesting to think about what the industrialization of agriculture has done in a certain way, because it has forced farmers who succeed in that world to think often in a much more short time frame, seasonally, not quarterly like Wall Street, but seasonally. And if you're a really big farming corporation, you might, like Cargill, you might be thinking quarterly, although they're privately held, so maybe not. And Woody Tash, who started the slow money movement, really talks about this a lot, the difference in the speed between money and the natural world. And there is a warping and a loss. I'm curious about ritual. She brought with her spiritual beliefs, her rituals from her spiritual beliefs. And you mentioned basically her struggle, her resilience. She has incredible resilience. A lot of people wouldn't be able to survive what she survived. And I'm just curious what you think about what the contribution of her spirituality is to her resilience.
It's a good question. At least as I observed in her Her spiritual life it's not a choice. I guess for many people, a spiritual life or whatever form it takes is not a choice. But I think that it can be in the context that you and I live in. You choose to follow your parents' religion or not. You choose to be born again as a Christian or become a Buddhist or what have you. For Ia, there's in her life and in her family and really in, I think largely in her world, it's not really a choice. It just, for her at least, it just is. This is the framework for understanding the world that her parents gave to her. It's fundamental in the way that she relates to the people and to the places around her. It is and when I say it is the traditional Hmong spiritual beliefs that we certainly don't have time to get into here. But it's very tied to the presence of a spirit world that is not conceptual and it's not separate. The Hmong spiritual world is right here with us. It might not be immediately visible, but
it's impacting.
Yeah,
everything.
The ancestors are present here with us right now, as are a whole variety of other spirits. And beyond that, there's a sort of larger cosmos and, again, a longer arc within which I believe Ia sees herself. I mean, as she has described it to me. One of the fundamental pieces of that larger cosmos, I guess, is that your fate is decided for you. It's written for you in the form of papers that are essentially given to you at birth. And so as Ia sees it, her destiny was predetermined. And what she's doing now is just trying to fulfill that destiny as best she can. Mm-hmm. She is a shaman as well as a farmer. And in both of those endeavors, she's guided by the understanding that her purpose here is to help and heal others. And so that creates a real framework for understanding her farming, both from the outside, but within the inside, from Ia herself. There are plenty of times that I certainly observed I would think, like, throw in the towel or like at least go home for the day. It's like 108 degrees, you're exhausted, you're sick, you've got nothing left. And yet she's driven by something completely other than her own personal health. At least as I've witnessed, she was driven by this purpose. But along with that sense of purpose, of really deep cosmic purpose, spiritual purpose, is the sense that the larger spiritual world will provide for you. And if you are fulfilling that purpose, you will be taken care of. You will get the help you need. You will somehow make it through. And that's what I witnessed over and over again on Ia's farm. It can feel, reading the book in some ways can feel just like a litany of
one disaster after another.
One disaster after another. And yet you witness Ia enduring, adapting, accepting, and finding a way to move forward. So I think when you talk about, how does the spiritual belief that she has relate to resilience, it's at the core of it, just believing that this is what she's meant to be doing and not questioning it in the way that someone without that belief might.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautifully said, and I see that. So I'm just very curious about the linkage between Ia, Harry, Virgil, the Podals. There is a through line that's kind of in what you said there about this perseverance, this faith, this continuing effort to push through challenges. The link I want to see if you will make is what do we need to learn from that in our time? Because you talked about what times we're living in, the very difficult times that we're living in and what lay ahead. And what can we learn from these four families that's applicable for us in our lives?
Well, I think if I had to answer in a single word, I would take one that you just spoke, which is faith. Their faith draws them together, whether it's Ea, Virgil, the Podals. They believe in different things. They have faith in different systems, but they have faith and they trust that they have the tools to find a way through. And that's paired with a commitment to persevering because of that long arc that we talked about. It is possible to be in agriculture today and to decide it's not worth it. The challenges are so great. I mean, it would take too long to list them, but people know them. Anyone who is trying to raise food on land right now is facing at least one climate-instigated challenge, right? If not many. And whether it's water in the Central Valley, the temperatures, my God, drought currently in the mountains of Laos.
Flooding in Iowa where things are getting wiped out.
Yeah, I mean, we could just go on and on and on. It would be forgivable and also pretty understandable for someone to just say, forget it. There are these deep roots tying each of the people that I've written about to the land that they're on and to the practice of farming. And because of that, they fall back on this faith and this trust that they'll find a way through. For people like you and me who are not farmers, ranchers, who are not drawing our livelihood from the land, I think it can be a little hard to transfer that lesson directly. I mean, at the end of the day, you and I are going to continue buying food at the store, having our water delivered by the municipal, water delivery system. And if it gets really, really hot outside, we'll probably just stay inside, right? So we don't need that faith directly. I guess the way that I see it, and this is essentially how I've always seen it, is that even though that lesson, the model that these people present to us isn't directly applicable to our lives as people who aren't in agriculture, the importance of supporting them for continuing to be a model for other people in agriculture, continuing to support them by structures within the government and community that allow them to continue and even, propagate their model, bring up new farmers or turn over existing farmers to a more resilient model. For me, that's what my entire professional life has been about, is trying to elevate these people and engender a respect for them and value them so that we can support them to not just prosper themselves, but to grow and multiply, and hopefully through that have an impact on a larger scale.
Beautiful. Wow, Lisa, as always, I've really enjoyed our conversation. And we ran out of time to talk about your next book, the book you're going to work on next, which we'll get to in the future. So I really want to thank you. That was a really beautiful conversation.
Thanks, Michael. I enjoyed speaking with you.
Before we go, one thing we didn't have time to talk about is Lisa's current effort to have the hungry season translated into Hmong, which is not a written language. The book will then be recorded as an audiobook so it can be listened to by Iamua and all the many Hmong people whose story runs parallel to hers. It's an exciting project, and Lisa needs to raise a little bit more money to get it done, and you can learn more on her website. That's lisamhamilton.com. I repeat, lisamhamilton.com. Please send her a little money to get the project done. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Roots of Change is a program of the Public Health Institute.